Do you know that in American schools, students, including both white and black, are being taught the whitewashed version of the transatlantic slave trade? They are being told that the transatlantic slave trade, also known as the Atlantic slave trade and triangular trade, through the Middle Passage, was a favor to Africans. This can be understood by knowing that the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, said about 240 years ago that black African slaves were being taught handicraft art by their white masters. This was said with pride on the made-up argument that white people were actually helping black people by enslaving them. That's the same version of the transatlantic slave trade that is being taught in American schools. Not only does it make young minds hate black people, but it also makes them insensitive to the fact that humans were enslaved, and they could be used like one uses an animal. They could be exploited, tortured, and killed. But what is being hidden by making young students insensitive? How are schools actually working to legitimize and justify the transatlantic slave trade instead of talking about the guilt of white people? In this documentary, let's know about the uncensored version of the transatlantic slave trade that schools never tell about.
The Black History Archives.
Let's get started. The Atlantic slave trade, which spanned from the early 16th to the late 19th century, was a catastrophic system of exploitation that tore over 12 million Africans from their homes. These individuals were forcibly transported under harrowing conditions to the Americas and Europe, where they faced unimaginable cruelty. An estimated 2.75 million Africans died during the Middle Passage alone, their lives claimed by disease, starvation, or violence. Unlike what's taught in schools that the Africans captured were already slaves in Africa, they were not slaves, but individuals with roles such as farmers, artisans, merchants, and soldiers thriving within their communities. However, a persistent myth, rooted in racism, falsely portrays Africans as naturally suited for slavery. This narrative has resurfaced in contemporary times. On July 21, 2023, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis claimed that slavery helped some Africans parlay their bondage into acquiring skills like blacksmithing. These comments, made in defense of Florida's revised educational standards, show the same logic used centuries ago to justify slavery. The idea that slavery provided enslaved Africans with opportunities for self-improvement is as false as it is offensive. Thomas Jefferson held similar views in his 1785 notes on the state of Virginia, where he suggested that Africans benefited from being taught trades by their white enslavers. Yet historical evidence contradicts such narratives. Many Africans arrived with specialized skills. Historian Michael W. Twitty notes that plantation owners specifically sought Africans with expertise in rice cultivation because Europeans lacked the knowledge to grow it. Similarly, African iron workers from West and West Central Africa were highly skilled long before they were enslaved. The Florida curriculum's framing of slavery's positive contributions ignores these realities, perpetuating a whitewashed history that dehumanizes African people. The process of enslavement began with violent captures in Africa, often facilitated by local collaborators in exchange for European goods. Captives were marched to coastal forts, where they endured inhumane conditions while awaiting transport. From there, they were loaded onto ships for the Middle Passage, a journey marked by unparalleled suffering. As Marcus Rediker outlines in The Slave Ship, A Human History, enslaved Africans were chained together in dark, airless decks, packed so tightly that they could not move. With no sanitation, diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy spread unchecked. Many captives succumbed to illness, starvation, or physical abuse, while others leapt overboard in acts of defiance or despair. Roughly 15 to 25% of captives died during the Middle Passage. Despite these well-documented atrocities, educational standards like Florida's failed to convey the full horror of these voyages. Instead, they focused on topics like slave revolts and the Underground Railroad without addressing the systemic brutality that prompted these acts of resistance. But how did all that begin? Well, the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas grew as European colonizers sought to exploit their colonies' agricultural potential. Initially, indigenous peoples were enslaved to work on plantations. However, the violence of conquest and the spread of European diseases devastated native populations, leading colonizers to turn to Africa. Portugal and Spain pioneered the Transatlantic Slave Trade, with King Charles V authorizing the shipment of 4,000 Africans to Spanish colonies in 1518. While these actions were framed as opportunities for Africans to convert to Christianity, the true motive was economic. As Eric Williams explains in Capitalism and Slavery, enslaved Africans became necessary to the growing colonial economies, particularly in the production of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The triangular trade system sustained the Atlantic slave trade, creating a continuous cycle of exploitation. European goods like firearms and textiles were exchanged for enslaved Africans, who were transported to the Americas to work on plantations. The raw materials produced through their forced labor, sugar, cotton, and tobacco, were then shipped to Europe, fueling industrialization and wealth accumulation. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. While Europe and the Americas prospered, Africa faced catastrophic losses. Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, argues that the trade depopulated the continent and stunted its economic development by removing its most capable individuals. Despite this, modern curricula often ignore the economic devastation inflicted on Africa, focusing instead on the benefits reaped by Europe and the Americas. Yet, the Florida State Board of Education compared slavery to indentured servitude contracts, obscuring this history. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans were treated as property, enduring lifelong bondage and systemic oppression. Frederick Douglass, in his 1845 autobiography, criticized the myth of the happy slave, calling it a tool of dehumanization. By perpetuating such narratives, modern curricula deny students the opportunity to understand the enduring impact of slavery and systemic racism on society. Minimizing the brutal realities of slavery not only erases history, but also perpetuates systemic and internalized racism. This whitewashing reinforces negative stereotypes about black businesses and institutions, as seen in personal anecdotes and systemic inequities. For example, black-owned businesses often face unfair lending practices, leading to higher operational costs. Yet these systemic barriers are rarely acknowledged in discussions about economic disparities. Another fact that is little told about is how Africans were treated like commodities. To ensure enslaved people arrived at their destination in saleable condition, captives were subjected to enforced exercises like dancing. These movements, far from being joyful or cultural expressions, were cruelly imposed to prevent muscular atrophy during the voyage. Armed crew members forced the captives to perform on deck, adding another layer of humiliation to their already dire plight. Food and water were scarce, with rations consisting of basic staples like boiled rice, yams, or beans. When supplies ran low, the enslaved were the first to suffer, as the crew prioritized their own needs and protected trade goods like barrels of wine over human lives. Starvation and dehydration were rampant, making survival for many captives unlikely. By the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade had become a massive operation driven by the plantation economies of the Americas. Brazil alone accounted for nearly half of the enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic, with over 5 million captives sent to its shores. Most others were destined for the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and South America, where working conditions were so brutal that life expectancy was often just a few years. Initially, the Portuguese enslaved Africans captured during tribal wars, but as demand increased, they ventured into the interior of Africa, conducting raids and forcibly taking captives. By the 1820s, enslaved Africans vastly outnumbered Europeans crossing the Atlantic, with women making up 4/5 of the African captives. The scale of this trade reflects the greed that fueled it, with human lives reduced to mere commodities for profit. To justify this system, racist ideologies were deliberately made, implanting white supremacy into the nation's fabric. Slavery wasn't just a tragic chapter in American history, it was the central cause of the Civil War. Yet according to a report by the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, these critical truths are often sanitized or omitted in U.S. classrooms. The SPLC report exposes the fragmented and often sentimentalized way slavery is taught in American schools. Maureen Costello, director of the SPLC's Teaching Tolerance Project, explains that students are frequently introduced to figures like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth as heroic abolitionists before they ever learn the harsh realities of slavery itself. Many students don't encounter the brutal facts of slavery until the 4th or 5th grade, and even then, the material is often softened to avoid discomfort. This fragmented approach reflects a larger narrative in American education that portrays the nation's history as a steady journey of progress. However, current issues like the rollback of voting rights protections, systemic racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, and the persistent segregation of schools and neighborhoods reveal how slavery's legacy continues to shape public policy and social structures. Students who are struggling to understand Black Lives Matter can't fully grasp it without learning about slavery, says Jackie Katz, a U.S. history teacher in Massachusetts. Yet many students remain wedded to the idea of the American dream, finding it difficult to reconcile this ideal with the realities of systemic oppression. The SPLC's findings are based on a comprehensive analysis of state standards, student and teacher surveys, and reviews of high school history textbooks. Using 10 key concepts developed by historian Ira Berlin, the report highlights glaring deficiencies in how slavery is taught. These concepts include slavery's economic importance, its protections in the Constitution, and its enduring legacy of white supremacy. The report reveals that the violence endured by enslaved Black people and their families is frequently downplayed or outright ignored, leaving students with an incomplete understanding of the institution's brutality. Slavery is often portrayed as a purely Southern issue, disregarding its profound economic and legal significance across the entire nation. Furthermore, the role of white supremacy in justifying and perpetuating slavery is rarely addressed, depriving students of the context needed to understand its enduring legacy. Perhaps most troubling, the voices and lived experiences of enslaved individuals are largely excluded, erasing their humanity and reducing them to abstract figures in history rather than real people who endured unimaginable suffering. These gaps leave students with a distorted understanding of American history. For example, only 8% of high school seniors surveyed could explain why Southern states seceded from the Union. Just 12% knew about the North's economic reliance on slavery, and only 18% could identify a significant outcome of Nat Turner's 1831 slave revolt. The SPLC report calls for a more systematic and comprehensive approach to teaching slavery. This includes centering the voices of enslaved people, examining the role of white supremacy, and highlighting slavery's economic importance across the entire United States. Using original documents and first-hand accounts can make these lessons more impactful and help students understand the human cost of slavery. Tell us, were you taught about the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in your school and college? Or did you learn about them by self-study and were surprised to know the real truth? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on the fact that as a Black community, we need to spread the truth and share the true Black history. We are trying to do it, and in that, we need your support. Please subscribe to the Black History Archives and click the bell icon so we can build a strong Black community.